Welcome to Module 4 of the No-Code Blueprint, How to Design a User Interface. So this module is going to focus on some best practice principles to design a really good interface, and the sorts of things we're going to cover off, as you see on the contents there, are using key drivers such as simplicity, efficiency, logic, all of those sorts of things. So we did touch previously in the previous module on the user interface, and in this module we're going to dive down into a lot more detail. So let's start off with some of the basics and think about simplicity. So take a look at the two screen grabs you can see on the screen here. Looking at these, which do you prefer and which do you think it would be easier to use? And also list your reasons why. A good UI should be as simple as possible while still looking good, of course. Apple is very good at doing this. And as you can see in the examples here, the one on the left is SAP, an accounting and ERP solution. Clearly, there is a need to capture and display a lot of data, but it's totally non-intuitive. You know, what is the difference between the tabs Sales Org 1, Sales Org 2, and some of the hidden tabs you can't see? Compare this to the one on the bottom right, which is an application called Float, which is used for project management. A lot more easier to understand and to navigate. So in terms of trying to keep a user interface simple, here are some of the key things to think about when you are designing your user interface. So first, keep it clean and uncluttered. Use plenty of white space and avoid using too many colors, fonts, and design elements. So on the previous one, the one that looked a little bit easier in the eye did have multiple colors, but there was a real purpose here, and that was to demonstrate to make it clear, you know, which people were on which project. So it was done with purpose and intent. But, you know, don't use colors and multiple fonts just for the sake of it. Second, use familiar design patterns. You know, people are more likely to feel comfortable using your software if it follows design patterns they are familiar with. Apple is a really good example of this, and if you look at any software that Apple creates natively, you'll see that consistency and ease of use. Third, make the user interface easy to navigate. Use clear and intuitive headings, menus, and buttons to help your users find their way around the software. Next, and point number 4, is to test your design with real users. So sitting and designing the UI yourself, it might seem intuitive, it might be easy for you to use and find your way around, but user testing can really help you identify any confusing or hard to use elements of your design, so you can then go and make improvements before releasing the software to a bigger group. And finally, be consistent. So use the same design elements, the same layouts, and the same language throughout the software to help users feel at home and know what to expect. So for example, on one screen, don't use the term customer, and then on another use the term client. You need to be consistent with language as well, and obviously some of the design elements. Right, next you need to think about efficiency, and to design an efficient user interface, you need to consider the goals of your users. So what is it they're trying to achieve and how you can make this easy using the UI that you are designing. So think very carefully about what you are expecting the user to do. For example, don't ask them for their first name, their last name, and their full name. You can work out the full name yourself programmatically. In fact, if you don't need the surname, don't even ask for the surname. So just a way to make sure that the user can efficiently input stuff into the UI, but also can efficiently get stuff out of the UI. Next is thinking about the logic embedded in your user interface, and this needs to be well thought out. So the UI should flow and the journey the user takes should be consistent with the task they're trying to complete. So where you are expecting a user to enter information, for example, think about going left to right or top to bottom, but don't kind of jump and zigzag around the place, because that's not the kind of way we do things. Obviously, if you are developing your software for alphabets or languages that read from right to left, you'll need to factor that in, because that's going to be different from the left to right approach that we typically take. And components of the user interface should make sense. For example, an OK button should be green and a cancel one should be red, not the other way around. Now, it seems like a very simple example, but trust me, and you'll see an example later, I've seen those sorts of things in the real world. Remember that your UI is not only a tool to get input from the user, as I said before, but also a way to provide feedback. And this means that at any time the user should be able to see what part of the UI they are busy with. So make sure that the cursor doesn't get lost and they don't know where they are on the screen, or that the mouse pointer is hidden. Also, you'll need to provide the user with some form of feedback when they complete something. For example, when a user adds a new contact and clicks save, they should receive some form of feedback saying that the contact has been successfully saved, if in fact that is the case. Now, obviously, having a message pop up every time is not the best and most efficient way to do it, but you can display a green checkbox somewhere, on the menu. There's various ways of doing this and providing this non-intrusive kind of feedback. As previously mentioned, feedback can be visual, it can be audible, or haptic, and in fact a combination of the above. So, it could ping a sound when there's a success or the record is saved. So think about using all of those approaches at your disposal. Next is accessibility. So your user interface should also consider users who might have poor eyesight or hearing. You shouldn't use fonts that are too small or colors that aren't properly contrasted. So a good example of this, and I see this a lot on sort of food preparation instructions, you'll have a darker blue background with light blue text, and especially as your eyes get a bit weaker, it becomes incredibly difficult to read that text just because the colors don't contrast enough. You may also need to introduce accessibility settings so that users can adapt the UI to their abilities, be that larger fonts, louder noises, or contrasting colors, for example, where people may be colorblind. Next, think about error handling, and this is a great example for highlighting that. These are real world examples. As I said, think about the logic you embed, green for good, red for bad. If I look at the first example here from Microsoft Word, it tells me an error has occurred, catastrophic failure. Now, catastrophic failure for me is like the world ending. Microsoft Word crashing probably isn't, but it doesn't even tell you about the nature of the error. The next one, this is a beautiful one. Obviously, someone's trying to close down a document and it says, "Are you sure you want to cancel this action? Click OK to cancel the current action or cancel to continue." So, we've mentioned feedback already, and this is especially important, when you get to things like this. When an error occurs, it's either because of a user action or an issue with the software. So the error needs to be handled eloquently. And in these two examples, neither are handled very eloquently. It's not obvious in the second one what the user should do. But then also think about it more broadly. Generally you don't want your application to be crashing or become unresponsive or to terminate unexpectedly. Now, you don't always have a choice over this depending on the platform that you develop on, but you do need to try and handle and trap errors as well as possible. Also then, the error should be descriptive and a helpful error message should be provided to help the user correct the error or to proceed in a way that won't have the error occur again. So a very good tool or approach for designing a good user interface is wireframing. And really this is an approach and set of tools that you can use to design your interface before building it. So essentially you'll create a non-detailed version for each screen using some software such as Figma, Balsamiq, or Adobe XD. You can also use tools like Miro. And these designs can then be tested on users to get their feedback before building the UI. Now, depending on the no-code tool that you're using, it would be as quick to build the UI in your no-code tool as doing it in a wireframing tool. So you'd probably just do that in the first instance. For example, if you're using something like Glide, then building a UI is really quick. However, a platform like Bubble is a little more challenging and it may be quicker to knock up a wireframe, even using PowerPoint, for example. Now, Generally, what a lot of professionals do is to do a low fidelity wireframe, like the examples you can see here. And once they've tweaked that and got the broad design right, they then move to a high fidelity version where you use a tool like Figma and it looks like the final product. It's great to test and to also advertise your software, for example, so you can show screen grabs of what your software might look like before actually building it. But it does involve a lot of effort to build those high fidelity versions. So what I would do is stick to the low fidelity versions like the examples you see here. And it also makes it easy, once having tested that user experience or that user interface, to then build it, because you don't have to make things up as you go. You've almost got your steps, you've got your design in front of you, and you can follow those steps to design, or actually to build a good user interface. Next, you want to be thinking about your typography or the sort of fonts you're using. So the key things here to consider, are using a font size between 15 and 25 pixels for body text. Use really big font sizes for headlines. Use line spacing of between 120 and 150% of the font size. It becomes really difficult when you have a lot of font to read and the lines are close to each other. Think about doing not more than 45 to 90 characters per line. Use good fonts. Don't use Comic Sans, please. Never, ever, ever, ever do that. And there are also some other horrible fonts that you should never use. There is a resource at the end of this module, which is Google Fonts. You can go and browse those. You can type up sentences and those sorts of things and see what they look like in different fonts before you implement those. Choose a font that reflects the look and feel you want for your website or application. So I kind of said never use Comic Sans, but perhaps if you're developing an app for children or a website for children, and it's got a funny thing like a clown at a circus, you could use that font. It's probably going to land better than Times New Roman. But if you're developing a business application, don't use a finicky font or something that looks handwritten, because it's not going to reflect the look and feel that you're asking for or wanting out of your product. And quite importantly, try and use only one font. I have used two in this presentation, one for headings and one for content. But, I think when you're designing an application, just be careful, because that's slightly different than a slide deck. Think about using one font only. The next thing is, use colors like a professional. Think about using only one base color. Use a tool if you want to use more colors. And again, there's a resource at the end here which has color palettes on, and it'll show you which combination of colors go well together and the applicable hex codes, so it's easy to implement. Use color to draw attention, so use it sparingly. Don't have like red all over the show, because it's just going to be messy. Now the next one is quite controversial. There's generally a guideline that says never use black in your design. You can see my slides are dark, they're gray. And if you use dark mode generally on an operating system, it tends to be not pure black. Again, I think it's personal choice. But again, up for you to decide in terms of how you want your app to look. And then choose your colors wisely. And this goes back to using the combination of colors and, using the right colors for what you're wanting to achieve. So feel free to use those resources at the end of this module. Next, working with images. Where you have an image in your application, try and put relevant text directly on the image. It makes it easier to digest and it fits better together. What I tend to like doing is overlaying the image. So creating the image and then putting a layer of black, for instance, on it, and then making that transparent or semi-transparent. And that just makes it look a little more professional. Where you have free-flowing text, put that in a box. Sometimes think about blurring the image slightly, if you don't want the image to detract too much from what you're trying to achieve in that user interface. Right, next is thinking about working with icons. Use icons to list your features or your steps. Icons are very easy and intuitive to follow. Make sure they're representative of what you're trying to talk about. You can use icons for actions and links. So a link to a different page, a link to create an action like a save or save as. Icons should be recognizable. So to the bit I said in the first point, label your icons because sometimes you may choose an icon that is abstract from what you're trying to communicate, and the label kind of backs that up. Icons, however, shouldn't take center stage. They should be part of your design, but not the design in its entirety. And you can also use icon fonts whenever possible because these are easier to render rather than being saved as images or scalable vector graphics. So just some good design principles there in terms of how to work with icons. When it comes to spacing and layout, then 6 key things to think about here, and that is putting white space between your elements. So making sure that the stuff's not too bunched and there's lots of white space. It makes the interface look clean. Put white space between your groups of elements. So going back to the example you saw on one of the earlier slides, there's separate sections for capturing different bits of detail in that SAP application, but they're kind of all bunched together. There's no real logical separation between those groups. If you're building a website, put white space between the sections, whether it's just a general website or a landing page. And then think carefully about where you want your audience to look first. So if they're opening up a screen to create a new customer record, you probably want them focusing on the customer name first and not focusing somewhere, customer telephone number or address. So think about where you want them to aim their attention when they first get to that part of the user interface. Make sure you establish a flow that corresponds to your content's message. So again, whether it's following a logical sequence in terms of capturing customer data, for example, or whether you're providing feedback to a user and a set of instructions, make sure that that flow corresponds to what you're trying to get across. And then also make sure, again, to use white space to build that flow more effectively. So in summary then, a lot of your content will probably be text. So good typography is a key element to making a good looking application or website. Images are getting more and more important in design. So choosing great images and putting text on them is an essential part of your work. Also think about how you use stock images, because those do sometimes jump out as being stock images. Icons are a good way of setting a friendly tone for your website, but use them carefully. The adequate use of white space makes a website or application look professionally designed. So use it a lot, but in the correct way. Build your layout by defining the visual hierarchy of your content or what you're trying to achieve in a particular part of the UI. White space also plays an important role in this. Then, your application should be designed in a way that ensures that both the user and you as an application developer achieve your goals. And this together is the user experience. And then finally, it's very important that you get inspired by looking at some well-designed applications from other designers. So look at some of the stuff out there, expand on those examples I shared earlier. Look to see what resonates with you, what you find easy to use and visually appealing. Look at what you don't like, so you kind of know what the opposite side or the other side of that coin looks like. So do some research up front and get some design ideas. Now the resources that I mentioned, there's 4 that I've made available here, and the links will be available as part of this module. Number 1 is a user interface design checklist. Now this is a fantastic website. It allows you not only to design UIs, it's got checklists for everything related to UIs. So, the best way to design a list, the best way to design a text box. So really good stuff there. Resources 2 and 4 are all about colors. So you can see, for example, the gradient hunt one predefine some good gradients to use. So you'll see, for example, on my slides, I've got a gradient down the side here. Gradient Hunt provides exactly those. And then Google Fonts, as I mentioned, that's also available to help you choose the right font. And finally, as I mentioned, color palettes show you a way of using colors in a complementary way. So that's it for this module. It's been a lot to take in, so feel free to come back and look at this again. Take a look at those resources on the web. They are really good, and I look forward to seeing you in the next module.